So thank you all very much for coming out tonight. My subject is the history of the conversion of African Caribbeans to Islam in the local context in the UK. Now that brings up several different things. I have to define a few things. And I'm struggling with these definitions because, well, I think I don't need to define the word Islam. I'm not going to anyway. Because contrary to what Brother Ismail said, I am in fact not a theologian. Sheikh Hassan here is the theologian. So I bow to him when it comes to matters of discussing fine points of hadith and Quran and stuff like that. So I'm not going to attempt to define the word Islam. The problem is to define the word Caribbean. The definition of the word, what is a Caribbean? What is an Afro-Caribbean? Is a more problematic thing. The first word in the title, history, I want to start with that. Why do we study history? And I think I might start by saying that history is indispensable to a people who have been disconnected from their past. And I believe our people, right, you see I've already started doing it. I've already started speaking about our people, the Caribbean people, without actually defining what they are. That tells you, that speaks to the difficulty I have with defining what a Caribbean person is, African Caribbean person is. So I will start with the easy bit. I think we learn history for several reasons. One of these is to establish a continuity that actually makes you a people. If there's a meta-narrative that runs through the generations, that reinforces what makes a person a people. Like if you all remember the book Roots, how many of you all were conversed when the book Roots came out in the late 70s? And Alex Haley went on this search and he met the family in Jufure called the Kinte family, and he met a man called the Jali. And that man began to recite the history, and he said, this one is the son of so-and-so, who was the son of so-and-so, until the tree was, the reconnection had taken place. And what you see therefore is a continuous narrative. And I think that handed down history is what is important and makes a people a people. Are people disconnected from the history, it becomes a problematic issue. And that's why I'm struggling with the term Caribbean. I'll be saying this from time to time as I develop this lecture. We learn history because, well, not only so that we will know our place in history, our place in the scheme of things. Recently, we saw some history being made across the water, across the channel. History is being made in Germany, history is being made in France. So, sometime later, someone will come on this podium and be discussing that history. Because even as we speak, we're making history. So, I'm saying we learn history in order to discover where our strengths lie, but more importantly, where our weaknesses lie, in order to correct them. Because I think a people who continue making the same mistake will end up with the same problems for generations to come. In fact, it becomes compounded. So with that proviso, with those sort of caveats, I really want to start this. Islam seems to have appeared. I'm not going to talk about, I don't know tonight, I don't think my remit extends to talking about slaves who were taken from West and Central Africa to the Caribbean. I don't even think my remit goes back as far as Edward Wilmot Blyden and that period. I think what I'm supposed to discuss here is Islam in Britain, how it arrived in Britain among the African Caribbean population, and how it has changed and adapted over the 2 or 3 decades that our people have been Muslims. So I don't think tonight is the place for me to go back to discussing the Fulani tribes in Africa, or the Serahule, or the Wolof, or the Mandinka, or those sort of Yoruba, the Hausa, the Kanuri. I don't think tonight it's about that. It's more about what happened on the other side of the water. And that's what I'm going to be discussing. Now, we must understand that the Caribbean migration to America actually predated the Windrush. Windrush, which is the Caribbean immigration en masse in the 50s and 60s to Britain. There had been going on for some time an emigration from the Caribbean to the Americas. Now, these two things come together in the person of, and I'm going to call individual names and I'm going to have to apologize if there are names I've forgotten. There are many names in the Caribbean community that deserve mention tonight, and I'll only remember one or two of them. But Michael X, who is very famous in history, is a name that comes to mind because Michael X, from Trinidad, spent a considerable amount of time in America, and he was a friend of Malcolm X too. And that is important because we have to understand this early conversion to Islam in Britain. Where did it come from? And there was a kind of connection between African Caribbeans in America and African Caribbeans in Britain. There was a connection there. And Islam did not seep across from the Indian. When I say Indian, I mean what we refer to in this country as Asian. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India itself, even Afghanistan. People from all these areas came to the Caribbean as indentured labor from about 1838 to about 1918. And they brought Islam with them as well. And that reinforced Islam where they were in large concentrations, like Trinidad, Suriname, and Guyana. There were large concentrations of Indians, and many of them were Muslim. But there had been less of a crossover from the Islam. I think when you look at the Indian Islam, it was the Indian Muslims were already a minority among the larger Hindu population. So they felt like a minority within a minority. And within them, you had Sunni and Shia. So the Shia felt like even a smaller minority. So it's a very small minority of Shia in the Muslim community. Then you have the Sunnis, and that's also small, but bigger than the Shia. And then you have the Indian population, which is largely Hindu. And then you have the African population. I can give an example of a place like Trinidad, where you have Indians, Africans, Chinese, Arabs from Lebanon and Syria. And all of this melting pot is in the Caribbean. And therefore, for some people, if they would see a mosque, they would call it the Hindu temple. They were not clear what a mosque was. So up to the 50s and 60s, there was very little crossover between the Islam brought by the Indians as early as the early 1900s and the African Caribbean population. Now, that transitioning began later, but right at the beginning, it was movements like the Noble Drew Ali, Moorish Temple of Science, out of which grew things like the Nation of Islam, which grew later into the Islam of Warithuddin Muhammad. And during all that time, there was this crossover across the Atlantic. Malcolm X famously made journeys to Africa and to Britain, and people began to see Islam as relevant because the African American or the African in the diaspora saw himself as a person embattled. He saw himself as a minority. He saw himself as oppressed, just up from slavery. When I was a child, even in my childhood, there were Jim Crow laws in America. So that is to tell you how recently Jim Crow laws were abolished. The desegregation of the South is quite recent. It is in my childhood that this took place. So what I'm trying to say is, Islam at that time was identified with the politics of protest and an affirmation of identity. And I think that is the important thing. When we try to understand why you had movements like the Ansarullah movement, the Nation of Islam, Noble Drew Ali, the 5 percenters. I'm not going to define all of them tonight because I realize my time is short and I haven't even gotten through the first page of this. You had all these. So what I'm trying to say basically in a nutshell, Islam at the beginning was a religion of resistance and of identity. It was about identity politics. Now, what seems to have occurred, and a lot of this came out of the inspiration of the Nation of Islam, so you have to see it in that sort of context. Then what happens later on? I mean, you have people like Muhammad Ali who made Islam popular, famous. And Ali himself made that transition like Malcolm X did from the Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam much more quietly. Now, I think we have to understand why these people became Muslim. A lot of people in the West felt that, well, what passed for Christianity was a very unclear religion because the people who brought Christianity to them, to be quite honest, were not the best examples of Christianity at all. The plantation overseers in the Caribbean had carte blanche to do what they wanted with men or women slaves who had no right of redress. So it is from such people that we learned our Christianity. So, to some extent, the disjointed families, the whole discourse of protest, Islam seemed to supply an alternative spiritual identity, but more clean living. It told people, I mean, there were the stories in Brazil around the time of the 1835 uprising, the jihads. I don't know if you all knew in Brazil, I'm not supposed to deal with that bit of history tonight, but in 1835 in Brazil, you had jihads, Hausa and Yoruba Muslims who rose up against the Portuguese, and for a time it seemed that they were going to be successful. But what the people at the time writing about Muslim leaders like Dandara, there's a couple of other Muslim leaders, they went to bed early, they rose early, they were disciplined, they got married, they looked after their family, they protected their families, they looked as best they could under those circumstances of slavery, they looked after their children, they forswore drink. Most of the slaves, in order to deal with the harsh conditions of slavery, would drink. You have these stills where the sugar cane is pressed and you have your rum and you drink that, and the Muslims wouldn't. So I think we have to look at that. It's not just the politics of identity. Islam seemed to offer a cleaner way of life. You would not take. In fact, Elijah Muhammad had a book, How to Eat to Live. So people were concerned about that. And these are the things we have to look at when we think of why there was that beginning, that rush towards Islam in the community. Now later on, I like to draw a distinction. Of course, there was also that sense of militancy. Islam seemed to supply to a lot of the people. In fact, in my childhood, the Kung Fu films were very much in vogue. You all may know Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan and Jet Li, but you all don't know Wang Yu. And you all don't know Chen Sing, because these predated Bruce Lee, right? And for a long time, a lot of people who saw a kind of mystical East in the self-defense and the martial arts of Kung Fu saw the same in Islamic prayer. They saw a kind of yogish sort of nature to the way you prayed and the discipline of the martial arts. So a lot of people who became Muslims were adept at martial arts, because the whole idea of jihad seemed to resonate with that. So you have a number of factors why people in the 60s and 70s became Muslim. Now, I think when we go into the late 70s, a game changer occurs. And in the late 70s, in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power in Iran, ousting the Shah. And things, for the first time, the world begins to talk about militant Islam. The world begins to discuss something called When I was a boy, and you went to give dawah or something, nobody would say, "Boy, are you Muslims so why are you Muslims so violent?" No one spoke. That never entered anyone's consciousness. A game changer occurred in 1979, and people began to see there was a person who was prepared to stand up to the West. And you need to go back to your history books and find out what was happening at that time. It's very important to understand the nature of 1979. There were many people being overthrown at the time. I think Idi Amin was one. The guy in Somoza in Nicaragua was another one. There were a few revolutions going on, and the Iranian Revolution was one of them. You have to understand, two things happened at that time. Some Caribbeans gravitated to Shiism. Others adopted the militancy of the Iranian Revolution. Of course, the West countered by creating a bigger divide than there already existed between the Sunni and the Shia by propping up Saudi Arabia as a counterweight to Iran. And that has its resonances in people who converted in the Caribbean. You see, already a small community was beginning to become even more splintered and fractured. I want to underline this because we are a people who already suffer from broken families. Unless you're from a rural community in the Caribbean, most people are post-slavery, suffer the kind of trauma that, there's no extended family that you can think of. So what I'm trying to say is, already we were a small community of Muslims being further splintered. And how that affects in this country, what happens, people start moving, as people become aware of these things, people began to leave the Ansarullah community, people began to leave the Nation of Islam, and especially with the conversion of Waruddin, and come into more Sunnite Islam. This is in the 80s now. I've moved into the 80s. So there is more an emphasis on proper practice. It's less about the politics of protest and more about let's understand how you grow your beard, let's understand cleanliness in Islam, let's understand tafsir, let's understand how to pronounce the Quran in Arabic. Many people up to that time didn't know more than a couple surahs just to pray in Arabic. So we had teachers in this country we had help in this country like Sheikh Salah Jane, who came over from Sierra Leone. Much later in the 90s we had Sheikh Boadi, but I'll come to the 90s. I'm just talking about the 80s now. Another game changer took place in the 80s. Remember, this is a time when there were very few. You couldn't look around the streets and see the amount of Somali people that you see today. So Islam was perceived up to the time as a light brown-skinned religion. A straight-haired, brown-skinned religion. That's before the Somalis arrived. So we were an aberration. The Caribbean was a strange thing as a Muslim, not just to the traditional communities, but to our parents. For our parents, this was what are these children doing? What have we done that they must go and adopt these people's religion? So you have to look at the Caribbean as pulled between two factors. Some of them were asked to leave their parents' home, to the extent we had to establish the Ash-Shahada Housing Association in the spot which is today Brixton Mosque and Gresham Road. That was established in order to house Caribbean people who were basically turfed out by their parents. Because a lot of our Caribbean people, as I said, if you read the Voice newspaper, you wouldn't think that Islam has anything to do with the Caribbean experience. And these are what our parents are. I mean, they've come from that sort of background. So the Caribbean Muslim had all of these factors influence. Then comes the Rushdie affair. And with the Rushdie affair, the whole consciousness of Islam as a protest and a problem from the time of Ayatollah Khomeini now into the late 80s takes another shift. It shifts up another gear, and young people of heritage communities now, young Moroccans, young Pakistanis, young Bangladeshis, are beginning to be more interested in their religion. Now they're beginning to meet us on a level coming into Islam. And these two sort of things interface. And what begins to change in the Caribbean community is there's less of an emphasis on the politics of identity. Still the politics of protest, but less so of racial identity. It's less about having an African name. It's less about wearing African clothes. Well, I kind of got stuck back in that period, and I hope to God never to come out of it. I love African clothes. Now, but the identity idea became less and less. Now, as we go into the 90s, you have other factors involved. Yes, there's still a relationship with America, but that's like with NWA and Fight the Public Enemy. There's that sort of relationship influencing young people in this country. It's about protest. But something seems to have happened here in the 80s. In the boom Thatcher years, people began to feel they had already reached the promised land. You know, the old song, I have the brains, you have the looks, let's make lots of money or something. Songs like that, yuppies, and then you had buppies. So we had reached the promised land, and Muslims are not immune to what other people feel. Let me underline this clearly. So Muslims began to take on board a sense of, we do not need identity politics anymore. We're just Muslims. We don't need to be Africans. We don't need to be African Caribbeans. It is sufficient to be a Muslim. Now, this in the 90s dovetailed with, I'm just jumping ahead of all this, this in the 90s dovetailed with some serious events occurring right here in Europe. Number one, anybody remember what happened in 1993, 1994? Bosnia, right? Soon following on the heels of Bosnia, Kosovo. Kosovo, also Muslim. Following on right on the heels of that, Chechnya, right in Europe. So what happens now, Islam is identified, young people here saying this is Europe, these are our people. Of course, for many people for the first time realize that they have white Muslims. A lot of us didn't know that white Muslims existed, just like it was strange for many communities to see black Muslims. But so the politics of protest intensified in the younger generation. And now the Caribbean goes with this. So there is less of an emphasis on identity as a people. See, I've come back to that word again. How do we define what a Caribbean is? It's becoming more and more difficult to define that. The Caribbean is Muslim convert, is still a person of protest, but the protest is not twinned with a search for identity anymore. The Islam is the identity. So we go into the 90s and we have young people being, I don't like the word radicalized, young people becoming indignant young Muslims of Bangladeshi origin who saw their parents being racially abused and did nothing about it because they couldn't, they were children. They saw these things happening in the East End. Young Moroccans who hadn't been practicing Islam for a long time suddenly came back to their religion, and to some extent to do with seeing African Caribbeans becoming Muslim, because in Ladbroke Grove in particular, where we had one of our first mosques, Masjid Arujua, not far from where the Mangrove restaurant was in Ladbroke Grove, Trinidadian mosque. Well, Sa'adallah, the Imam, was from Trinidad, and he was one of the first converts to Islam in this country in the 50s. The Moroccans would come there, and the Moroccans would be surprised to see, well, these people are putting us to shame. We like to hang out with Trinidadians because we all smoke weed. But now they're not smoking weed anymore, they're praying. And it started to, a sea change began to take place among the Moroccan community. Now in the late 90s, an entire change takes place with an influx of Somalis. I'm not saying these are the first Somalis. I'm rushing ahead. There's a lot of stuff I've got here, but I'm going to leap ahead because my brother has to get onto reparations. The Somali community changed the color of Islam in this country to a large extent. I remember when I lived here, you saw a few Somalis in Cardiff, in Sheffield, in the port cities, because they are among the first, with the Yemeni, immigrants to come to this country. Among the first were the Yemeni. They came in the 1900s, very early period. But in the 1990s, late 1990s, and it's still ongoing, but up to the mid-noughties, the mid-2000s, there was a large influx of Somalis. And that too does have its impact on what the Caribbean, because the Caribbean people were confused by them. Because the Caribbean people looked at them, to put it in the words of a young guy, they're a black but a different kind of black. You know, this young Muslim black guy was confused because, then you realize that looking similar in terms of hair texture and skin color is not enough for somebody to give you their daughter to marry. Right? And I think a lot of Caribbeans were shaken. We could take it from the Asians, but we couldn't understand why this would happen with Somalis. And so you have this large population of other Muslims. There's something else I wanted to say about that. Yes, and I have to also mention, in the late 90s, because Finsbury Park Mosque comes to the fore. I know you want to know what all this has to do with the Caribbean community. I'll meet you all at a point soon. Algerians, a large number of Algerians came. France actually encouraged this secretly by opening the refugee camp at Sangat at night and telling them to go across the channel. And they hid out among the Moroccan community at first before hiving off and forming their own communities. So all of these different, this is a big soup. The Muslim community here is not like the Muslim community in France, which is predominantly Algerian, or the Muslim community in Germany, which is predominantly Turkish. The community here is far more mixed. Yes, we know there's a massive Bangladeshis, a large number of Pakistanis, a large number of Somalis, a substantial amount of Yemenis and Moroccans, now a load of Iraqis and Kurdish Iraqis and Turkish. That whole Turco-Kurdish bloc from George Bush's misadventure in 2003. You have Lebanese and Palestinians. You have all these people impacting on young Caribbeans. And now that we're in the late 90s and noughties, our children are growing up with them. Now that's where things begin to change. Even less, therefore, is there an emphasis on the politics of racial identity. It's more about, well, these people represent a truer form of Islam. So in order to dramatize Islam in a better way, it is better that we become like them. So there is I don't know how to put this tactfully. Our people seem to marry out into other communities as a result of this with a kind of a studied purpose. I mean, there was this a high rate of exogamy, as they say in anthropology, in the Caribbean convert community. I'm not saying just the Caribbean converts, but it became worrying to the point where if you really wanted to discuss an African Caribbean Muslim identity, it was going to become more and more difficult. If you were born here of Jamaican, or not even Jamaican, a Jamaican parent and a Trinidadian parent, and neither parent actually told you about either Jamaica or Trinidad, and then you married a Moroccan girl or a Somali girl, and that child is not, how could you in all honesty sit that child out and tell them about the Caribbean, of which you know little or nothing? And that's why giving a talk like this to me is fraught with inherent complications, because as to what a Caribbean is, a people, an ethnicity, a race, or what? So that is why it's really hard to give this talk with a sense of the future, looking down the road, with a sense of history, saying, well, right, what next for the Caribbean community? What are the problems these young people face? Are they similar to the black community from which they came, where you have in a population where we are only 2%, you have over 11% in prison, which is as alarming a statistic as black boys in prison in America. Muslims, so, or do we have the Muslim problem, where you also equally have a disproportionately large number, it goes unreported, of young Muslims in jail? Now we are both Muslim and black. I mean, so what dovetails here? These are things I think my brother Sheikh Hassan will discuss, the problems in the community and how we're going to look at them with a view to solving them. It's not easy for a Caribbean person arriving at the age of marriage to say, right, I'm not going to speak to my parents and they'll find me someone. Yeah. Yet if he's going down the road and he sees this sister and he says to her, Assalamu alaikum, sister. Now, he don't mean anything bad. He's a man without a community. He sees somebody he likes, but we don't have a channel up. This is Sheikh Hassan's topic. I don't want to go there. What I'm trying to say is we have problems that are different from heritage communities who might say, astaghfirullah, bro, that's vile. What you're doing is vile. That's not Islamic. Yet he can go marry his cousin because his family is massive. He got 60 cousins. He marry any one of them. Our people, some of us hardly know our fathers. I'm going to be brutally honest. It's different. So what I'm trying to say is I've given a quick history where we started with our Islam was a journey of the politics of identity and cleaner living. We wanted an alternative to the bookies, the betting shops, the single parenthood. I did that, but I shouldn't do that because it's not just about the sisters. It's about the irresponsible brothers. Okay? But the single parenthood, all of these, I'm stepping on my brother's topic. But this is what initially brought us to Islam. And he grew up with me in Trinidad. He knows how we cleaned up communities. There was a shooting and some murders in Picton the other week where we had that mosque up on the hill. It wasn't like that when we lived there. About 30 years ago, it wasn't like that. So what I am trying to say is, Islam was not, I'm not going to just say it was all about being black. No, it was about clean living, clean thinking. And somewhere along, with all the things that were happening in the world, it is good that geopolitically we got tied into it, because one of the beautiful things about Islam is that it turns your head from the West and gives you an alternative perspective, right? The world doesn't just revolve around New York. It doesn't. There are other places in the world. And that's the beauty of Islam. It gives you an alternative spiritual language, Arabic. And Arabic is one of the most precise languages. If you get the grammar of Arabic down, you could master many a language on this earth. It's one of those kind of languages. So these are some of the beautiful things Islam brought to us. But what it also brought to us is it further fractured us from our own people. Whoever they are. Remember I said I don't know what the Caribbean really is. It detached us from our parents. And we never fully got integrated with the traditional communities. And in some sense, people without a culture begin to overcompensate. And we did that, and you find things like in the white widow scenario. I'm not just saying it's among black people, but her husband was of Caribbean origin. You get that sort of situation where we become, nature abhors a vacuum. You've heard that expression in English. Nature abhors a vacuum. If there is something empty, something will fill it. If there is an empty space in nature, it will get filled. People lacking a culture, and I know culture has become the C word, and that is also a problem for the Caribbean, because for most Caribbeans, he's bought into the tourist brochure of what he is. We drink rum, we play cricket, we play dominoes, and we go to shebeen, dances, you see. This is what the Caribbean is. So the Caribbean actually starts off hating himself. So sometimes his adoption of Islam is not only a rescue, it imbues him with a kind of arrogance over his own people. And he stops doing the dawah. And when you stop doing the dawah, effectively, you're becoming a cult. You're becoming a narrow little cult. Whether you have gravitated to Sufism, and I was going to mention in the last, because I mentioned Sunni and Shia, and it's only fair of me to mention Sufism too. In the 80s, there was a kind of focus among some Caribbeans on Naqshbandi Sufism. Towards the noughties, the 2000s, it became more an Afrocentric Sufism called the Tijaniya movement. And you'll find it's proliferating in this country. It's big in the Americas. And there's a lot of interaction between the Senegal, on West Africa in particular, Senegal, a town called Kaolack, and communities in Britain and communities in America. And a lot of black people looking at the troubles that I mentioned in the world, I outlined, and the troubles that you see happening in France, and decided, look, if this is the way Islam is going to be projected, I refuse to be a part of that. So to some extent, the retreat into Sufism is a kind of a denial of that kind of discourse. And a lot of Caribbean people have also find themselves in that. And it does speak, the Tijani movement to some extent, to their desire to find their African selves. It does speak to that to some extent. So I also have to factor that in. I think I've gone on a bit about this. I'm just going to say the last thing about I talked about the 90s, and I'm going to talk about the 2000s really quickly. And what I want to say is that while the Islam of the 60s was an Islam of racial identity and protest, of course I mentioned, remember people like Abdel Nasser was both, he was seen as anti-West. Remember when he nationalized the Suez Canal? I'm asking the young people on purpose because they don't know they haven't a clue what I'm talking about. When Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, I don't think I was even born. But basically, he was seen as the pre-Ayatollah. He was, they call him the tiger on the Nile, the Hitler of Egypt. They gave him a lot of bad names because he said, look, this Suez Canal is in Egypt and Egypt is ours. And that was a Muslim standing up. And Malcolm X met people like him. Malcolm X met Ben Bella of Algeria. Now, Ben Bella was a socialist. But of course, most of the countries in Africa leading the charge of anti-capitalism and independence and decolonialization were Muslim countries. And there were leaders like Ahmad Sékou Touré of Guinea, Conakry. There are three Guineas, but Guinea, Conakry, the one you hear about in the Ebola. That is Guinea, Conakry. The first leader was Ahmad Sékou Touré, and he decided, I wouldn't want any part of the French Commonwealth. I care not for it, right? He was a Muslim and a socialist. Ben Bella the same, a Muslim. Jamal Abdel Nasser the same. So what you found is Islam at that time was seen as a part of like general anti-colonial protest movement. That had happened. Now today, something different has happened. The Twin Towers were knocked down on 9/11. The socialist movement, the Chomskyite movement, the anti-capitalist movement would say, you know, capital got its two front teeth knocked out. The Muslims say Satan got his two horns knocked off. You see? And there's movements begin to differ now. Instead of the socialist or the anti-capitalist movement making common cause with Islam, Islam clearly defined itself, and people like Gaddafi found themselves in trouble. Because Gaddafi now, as a Pan-Africanist, a Muslim, and a socialist at the same time, had to choose a path because Islam, or radical Islam, or protest Islam, clearly defined itself in the person of Al-Qaeda. And now he has to make it. So I know that affects young people because young black people, up to that time, the ones who grew up in my era, we identified with the politics of Gaddafi, not the religious politics, the anti-capitalist, the protest politics, the developing world aspect of this politics. It began to force a change between people. And now you find Muslims opening up a war on all fronts with everyone. We are at war. I mean, I'm going to just make a reference to what happened in France. I mean, you have two things going on at the same time. The anti-Semitism in France, anti-Jewism, that kind, I mean, is still quite high. But now, because it appears that the attack is on two sets of people, what you find out is that we alienate another protest group of people. So there's a kind of where it almost seems that the Caribbean Muslim, in the middle of all of that, is you can multiply his isolation by the factor of 10. Because in all of that, in all of the Muslim being isolated in the world, as if it's open season against Muslims, the Caribbean within that Islamic Ummah is isolated. And now he has to work out an identity. How much Caribbeanness or Africanity or blackness must he bring with him or leave behind? And how, to what extent must he allow his Islam to be subsumed under the variant expressions of Islam today, whether it's Hizb ut-Tahrir, whether it's the Salafi movement, whether it's the Naqshbandi or the Tijaniya movements, whether it's whatever you have out there, the Caribbean person now has to make a decision. Am I going to be a Muslim that is concerned with the upliftment of my community? Or am I just going to say, I'm only a Muslim and I can pray in any mosque, and anywhere I find Muslims, I'm at home, and if they eat chapati, I will eat that, and that is my food there. And the next day if they're eating, I don't know what the people eat, kabsa, majbousa, kabsa, then that is mine, and I will not work at developing an identity of my own. And we have to ask ourselves these kind of questions and more. I mean, whether the community, where the community goes today, I leave in the hands of my brother Sheikh Hassan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you all very much for listening.